"Why so many scars, old man?" The question, sharp and laced with a casual cruelty, sliced through the low murmur of the hospital waiting room. It came from a young Marine, Sergeant Croft, whose uniform was so crisply pressed it looked like it could cut glass. His posture was perfect, his jaw set with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed his rank, and his youth made him judge, jury, and king of this small, sterile kingdom. He was speaking to an elderly man sitting quietly on one of the plastic chairs, a worn tweed jacket draped over his thin shoulders. The old man, Samuel Hayes, didn't look up at first. His hands, resting on his knees, were a testament to a long and difficult life. They were gnarled with arthritis, the skin thin as parchment. But what drew the eye was the lattice work of pale silvery scars that crisscrossed his knuckles and snaked up his forearms, disappearing under the sleeves of his simple button-down shirt. More were visible on his neck, a particularly jagged one peeking out from the collar, a faded map of some forgotten battle. Samuel finally lifted his head, and his eyes clear and steady as a winter sky met the sergeant's. There was no anger in them, no fear, just a deep, immeasurable patience. "They're old," he said, his voice a soft, growly whisper. Croft let out a short, derisive laugh. "Old? No kidding, Pops. I figured you didn't get him falling off your tricycle last week. I'm asking what from a bar fight. Get on the wrong side of a lawnmower." A few people in the waiting room shifted uncomfortably. A young nurse behind the check-in desk, Sarah, looked up from her computer, her brow furrowed with concern. She saw the scene unfolding, the brash, arrogant Marine pining for an audience, and the quiet old man who seemed to shrink under the verbal assault, yet somehow held a core of unshakable stillness. Samuel's gaze didn't waver. "It was a long time ago," he repeated, his voice still quiet, yet carrying a weight that made the sergeant's booming tone seem hollow. This placid refusal to engage seemed to infuriate Croft more than any argument could have. He saw it as disrespect, a challenge to his authority. He took a step closer, looming over the seated man. "A long time ago where? What was it? Some supply depot scuffle? Did you get a paper cut filing paperwork for a real war?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial mocking tone that carried across the entire room. "Listen, Grandpa, we see your type in here all the time. Guys who talk a big game about what they did back in the day. But those scars, they look a little too neat, a little too decorative." Sarah stood up, ready to intervene, but a stern look from her supervisor made her hesitate. This was a military hospital, and a sergeant outranked a civilian nurse in this unspoken hierarchy. She could only watch, her hands clenched into fists at her side. Croft wasn't finished. He pointed a rigid finger at the jagged scar on Uswer Samuel's neck. This one, for example, his finger was inches from the old man's skin. "What happened here?" "Trip over your shoelaces and land on a bottle cap." The room had grown quieter now. The low chatter had ceased, and all eyes were on the confrontation. Every veteran in that room, young and old, felt a collective tightening in their gut. They knew this type of arrogance, and they knew the quiet dignity of men like Samuel. Samuel's eyes finally left Croft's face, seeming to look through him, through the wall behind him, into a time and place far removed from this sterile, climate-controlled room. His expression didn't change, but something in his stillness shifted as if the temperature around him had dropped by 20. "That one," Samuel said, his voice barely audible, "was a gift." They were all gifts. Croft scoffed, throwing his hands up in theatrical disbelief. "Gifts? What kind of ridiculous answer is that? Who gave them to you?" Samuel's gaze drifted down to his own hands, turning them over slowly, studying the road map of his past. The world of the waiting room began to fade, the scent of antiseptic and floor polish replaced by the sharp metallic tang of frozen earth and cordite. The memory wasn't a choice. It was an ambush. The sergeant's pointing finger, the talk of scars, it had turned a key in a lock that had been rusted shut for over 70 years. It was the cold he remembered first, a cold so profound it felt like a living entity, a predator gnawing at bones and freezing breath in lungs. The snow wasn't white but a bruised blue-gray under a perpetually overcast sky, crunching under his boots like breaking glass. He wasn't an old man with thin shoulders, he was 20 years old, his body a tightly coiled spring of muscle and fear, a bar clutched in frozen hands. He had been part of a unit that didn't officially exist, called the Winter Ghosts. A name whispered only in the highest echelons of command. Their mission simple and impossible: disrupt enemy supply lines deep in the mountains of North Korea, miles ahead of the main UN forces, utterly alone. The scar on his neck was no bottle cap. It began with a high, thin whistle cutting through the howling wind mortar. He remembered shouting, pushing a younger soldier, Jimmy, flat into the snow just before a blinding flash erased the world. A white-hot fist slammed into the side of his neck, flipping him into the frozen earth, his blood melting the snow beneath his head into steaming crimson. Jimmy unharmed because Samuel had taken the blast. That was the gift Jimmy's life bought with a piece of his own. The scars on his hands came later, during weeks of brutal fighting, cut off and surrounded with no hope of reinforcement. They fought with bayonets, knives, bare hands. He remembered holding a bridge over a frozen river with 4 men against what felt like the entire Chinese army. The rifle stock slick in his hands, the recoil bruising his shoulder. The bayonet that sliced his hand open to the bone. The agony delayed only by the numbing cold. He held the bridge. His 4 comrades did not. Their lives were the gift purchased with the scar on his hand. Back in the waiting room, Samuel blinked slowly, the fluorescent lights harsh and alien as Croft's sneering face swam back into focus. The old man's eyes were different now, holding the chilling calm of someone who had seen the end of the world and returned. "They were given to me," Samuel said again, his voice clear and firm, "by men who had nothing left to give. They were paid for." Before Croft could respond, a new voice cut through the tension, a voice accustomed to command. "Sergeant." Croft flinched and spun around to find General Peterson standing not 10 feet away, a man whose presence made Croft's crisp uniform look like a costume. The general's eyes were fixed not on Croft but on Samuel, his expression filled with disbelief, reverence, and profound respect. He walked forward, ignoring Croft entirely, then knelt before Samuel, drawing a gasp from the room. "Samuel? Samuel Hayes, is it really you?" Samuel recognized him faintly. The general introduced himself as the son of Captain Robert Peterson of the 1st Marine Division, Chosin Reservoir. Samuel's expression softened. He had known the man. The general said his father had told him stories, whispered late at night, about a phantom unit called the Winter Ghosts. Men who held the line when no one else could. Who saved his company 3 times. Men who weren't supposed to exist. Samuel straightened at the name, a ghost resurrected. The general gently took Samuel's scarred hand and pointed to a faded tattoo. On his wrist, a wolf's head howling at a star, the mark of the ghosts. Rising, the general turned to Croft, his fury cold and controlled. "You stand in a room full of those who served. You dared to question this man's scars. You asked what scuffle caused them. Allow me to educate you." He pointed to Samuel's neck. "He got that pulling my father and 2 wounded Marines from a burning half-track under mortar fire. The shrapnel came from a round that would have killed them all. He refused a medic until every man was safe." He gestured to the hands. These he got at Chosin Reservoir after his unit ran out of ammunition. He held a pass for 4 hours with a broken rifle, a bayonet, and his bare hands. The general's voice sharpened. "Every scar is a life he saved. His file is classified. Of the 30 men in his unit, only 2 came home. He is one." Croft turned chalk white, trembling with shame as he truly saw Samuel for the first time, a living monument to courage beyond imagination. The general finished. "This man is Samuel Hayes, Medal of Honor, 2 Navy Crosses, a Silver Star, all awarded in secret. He never speaks of them because the honor wasn't in medals, it was in the survival of his brothers, the gifts they exchanged. Difference between those who dedicate their lives to martial arts and those who just, clean the floor where real fighters walk. James stood motionless in the center of the mat. But something had changed in his breathing. His eyes closed briefly, and for a moment, he was no longer in that gym in Denver. He was back at the National Gymnasium in Las Vegas 22 years ago, hearing identical comments from the audience before his world title fight against Victor the Demolition Man Petrov. "Look at that little black guy," someone in the stands had shouted that distant night. "I bet he won't last 3 rounds against a real fighter." James had won by technical knockout in the second round, but the victory had cost him dearly. The pressure of the racist comments had caused him to lose control during the following sparring session, resulting in the accidental death of Tony Rodriguez. "So janitor," Derek sneered, now circling James like a predator, "how about showing my students how not to do a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push a mop?" That's when Sarah Chun couldn't stay silent any longer. The 22-year-old purple belt in jiu-jitsu and master's student in sports psychology had spent the last 2 years documenting cases of discrimination in sports for her thesis. What she was witnessing was valuable academic material, but also deeply disturbing. "Sensei Derek," she interrupted firmly, "can I ask you a question? Why exactly do you think it's necessary to humiliate someone who is just doing his job?" The silence that followed was deafening. Derek slowly turned to Sarah, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of surprise and irritation. "Excuse me, Sarah, but who's teaching the class here?" "You are," she replied calmly, "but that shouldn't include racial humiliation disguised as a technical demonstration." Several students exchanged nervous glances. No one had ever confronted Derek like this before. The instructor felt his face flush with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Racial?" Derek laughed forcibly. "This has nothing to do with race. It has to do with respect for the martial art and knowing your place." James opened his eyes slowly. There was something in the way Sarah had spoken, in the courage of a young woman standing up to established authority, that reminded him of his younger sister Kesha. She had had that same determination, the same refusal to accept injustice silently. Kesha had died at 17, the victim of a stray bullet during a police confrontation in her neighborhood. James was competing in Japan when he received the news another person he loved lost, while he pursued glory in distant rings. Another reason to abandon everything and disappear into the simplicity of an anonymous life. "Sarah," Derek said in a dangerously low voice, "if you can't respect my teaching methods, maybe you should look for another gym. There are places more suited to people with your mentality." The threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she stood her ground. "My tuition is paid, Sensei. And I believe that everyone here deserves a learning environment based on mutual respect, not humiliation." That's when James did something no one expected. He started to smile. It wasn't a nervous or submissive smile. It was the slow, calculated smile of someone who had just found a reason to stop hiding. For 20 years he had carried the weight of guilt for 2 deaths that had indirectly resulted from his involvement in the fighting world, now seeing a brave young woman defending principles of justice that he had abandoned decades ago. James Washington began to remember who he really was. "Derek," James said finally, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made everyone in the room turn to him. "The young lady is right. This isn't about martial arts. It's about you trying to feel important by belittling others." Derek spun on his heels, his face red with indignation. "How dare you lecture me about martial arts? You don't even know what a dojo is." James took a step forward, and something fundamental changed in his posture. His shoulders straightened, His center of gravity lowered imperceptibly, and his feet positioned themselves in a stance that any experienced fighter would instantly recognize as perfect. "Actually," James said calmly, "I know exactly what a dojo is, and I know that this place stopped being one a long time ago." Derek felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. There was something about the way James moved now, the way he occupied the space, that awakened all of his instincts for self-preservation. But his wounded pride would not allow him to back down. "Enough talk," Derek growled, assuming his favorite fighting stance. "I'll teach you respect the hard way." Sarah watched the scene with growing apprehension, but also with professional fascination. She had documented hundreds of hours of sparring and competitions for her research. And something about the way the janitor moved reminded her of the great masters. She had studied in historical videos the economy of movement. The controlled breathing, the calm presence that radiated contained power. James closed his eyes briefly and allowed 22 years of muscle memory to resurface. Every technique perfected, every victory won, every lesson learned in the most brutal rings in the world. When he opened them again, Derek was looking directly into the eyes of Silent Storm Washington, 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. "Last chance to apologize," James offered kindly. "To her, to your students, and to turn this place back into a learning space." Derek laughed, but the sound came out nervous and forced. "Apologize? Man, you'll be begging for forgiveness when you're on the floor." What Derek couldn't see was that James had already identified all of his technical weaknesses, the high guard that left his body exposed, the tendency to retreat with his right leg first, the way he telegraphed his punches with micro-movements of his shoulder. 22 years away from the ring had not erased decades of refined technical analysis. Sarah noticed that other students were instinctively backing away like wild animals sensing an impending storm. Something in the energy of the room had completely changed, as if the air had become electrically charged before a lightning strike. It was when everyone laughed at Derek's latest taunts that something unexpected began to take shape in James's expression, not anger or a desire for revenge, but the calm determination of someone who had found a cause worth breaking a 20-year vow of silence for. Some of those present began to realize that something extraordinary was about to happen, even without fully understanding what their eyes were witnessing. Derek assumed his favorite fighting stance, the one he had used to intimidate beginners for years, feet shoulder-width apart. FISTS, clenched at chest level, weight slightly forward. The classic stance of someone who had learned martial arts in controlled environments against predictable opponents. James stood motionless for a few seconds, simply observing. His eyes scanned Derek from head to toe, automatically cataloging every technical detail, the high guard leaving his ribs exposed, the unstable base that compromised his balance, the excessive tension in his shoulders that telegraphed every move before it began. "Still waiting," Derek sneered, hopping slightly on his feet. "Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost?" That's when James did something no one expected. He started to move. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a subtle repositioning of his feet, a slight lowering of his center of gravity, his shoulders relaxing into a perfectly horizontal line. But to anyone who knew what to look for, the transformation was instantaneous and frightening. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. During 2 years studying sports biomechanics, she had analyzed hundreds of hours of footage of great fighters. And what she had just witnessed was the transition from an ordinary man to a born predator, a change as subtle as it was devastating. "Interesting," Derek muttered, his confidence wavering for the first time. There was something about the way James occupied the space now that awakened all of his self-preservation instincts. James took a step forward, and Derek instinctively backed away. The movement was so involuntary, so primitive, that several students noticed a black belt backing away from a janitor. The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. Problem? James asked softly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced everyone. Derek felt the blood rush to his cheeks. His reputation was being questioned in front of his own students. He couldn't back down now, even though every fiber of his being was screaming at him to stop and apologize. "No problem," Derek replied, forcing a smile. "Just admiring your posture. Did someone teach you that on YouTube?" The joke fell flat. No one laughed. The tension in the room had become almost palpable. "Actually," James said calmly, "I learned it at a place called the Las Vegas National Gym. Maybe you've heard of it." Derek frowned. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place the reference. Las Vegas? What kind of weekend boot camp did you do there? Sarah discreetly pulled her phone out and typed Las Vegas National Gym Martial Arts. What she found made her blood run cold. This wasn't just any prep course, it was where the world's greatest MMA champions of the last 3 decades had trained. "Derek," James continued, his voice still calm, "last chance. Apologize to Sarah for questioning her right to speak. Apologize to your students for turning this place into a circus. And most of all, apologize to yourself for becoming exactly the kind of person that martial arts should teach you not to be." He could have preserved what little dignity he had left. Instead, he attacked. Derek's first punch was technically perfect, a fast, accurate jab executed exactly as he had learned in the manuals. It was the kind of punch that worked against 99% of the people he had sparred with over the years. James wasn't in the 99%. The movement was so fast, so fluid, that half of those present couldn't even process what had happened. James simply wasn't where Derek's fist had been aimed. His body had slid to the side like water flowing around a rock, and suddenly Derek was off balance, his arm extended into thin air. "Nice try," James commented softly, already repositioned and perfectly balanced. "Clean technique, adequate speed, but you telegraphed the move with your right shoulder." Derek spun wildly, trying to locate his opponent. How had someone moved so fast? "Beginner's luck," he muttered. More to himself than to James. The second attack came in quick succession, jab, straight. Hook, 3 punches linked with the precision of someone who had practiced the combination thousands of times. It was his favorite sequence, the one he used to finish sparring sessions and impress beginners. Again, James simply wasn't there. This time, Sarah managed to follow the movement. James had lowered himself slightly, allowing the jab to pass over his head by inches. The straight punch found only air when he leaned back in an impossible curve. And when Derek threw the hook with all his strength, James took a small step back, causing the fist to pass millimeters from his chin. "Interesting combination," James observed. "Still breathing evenly. Works well against people who stand still, but you're leaving your left side completely exposed." After the hook, Derek was starting to sweat. This wasn't normal. He had landed thousands of punches in his life, and now he couldn't land a single one on a man who had supposedly never fought before. "Stop dancing and fight," Derek shouted, launching an even more aggressive sequence. That's when James decided the demonstration had gone on long enough. Derek's third attack, a desperate combination of punches and kicks, found only air once again. But this time, something different happened. When Derek recovered after missing all his blows, James was inexplicably closer. "How?" Derek whispered, realizing he had completely lost control of the distance. "Derek," James said softly, now an arm's length away. "Do you want to know the difference between someone who learned to fight in gyms and someone who learned in professional rings?" Before Derek could answer, James did something that defied everything those present thought they knew about physics. Without appearing to use any force, without any sudden or aggressive movements, he simply touched Derek on the chest with the palm of his right hand. Derek flew. He wasn't pushed or knocked down. He was literally propelled backwards, as if struck by an invisible wave. His feet left the ground. He traveled nearly 2 meters through the air, and landed on his back with an impact that made everyone in the room gasp. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek lay on the floor for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. There was no pain, just the irresistible force of someone operating on a level completely different from anything he had ever known. That ... Derek muttered, trying to get up. That's impossible. Sarah Chun had stopped breathing. In 2 years of studying martial arts, she had never witnessed such a controlled and devastating display of power. There was no brutality, no anger, just the clinical application of a technique she had only seen in legends. Actually, James said calmly, reaching out to help Derek to his feet. It's quite simple once you understand leverage, timing, and energy transfer. Principles I've learned over a 22-year professional career. Derek ignored the outstretched hand and stood up on his own, his legs still shaking. 22 years professional career in what? Sarah answered, her voice almost a whisper. You don't understand who he is, do you? Everyone turned to her, who was still holding her cell phone with the results of her search. On the screen, dozens of articles, photos, and videos confirmed what her instincts had already realized. James Washington, she read aloud, also known as Silent Storm. 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. Considered one of the best technical fighters in history. Retired undefeated after a 22-year career. Following an accident that resulted in the death of his training partner. The impact of the words hit the room like a bomb. Derek felt his face go pale as reality set in. He had challenged a living martial arts legend. He had publicly humiliated someone who could have knocked him out with a casual move. Five-time world champion, Derek stammered, all his arrogance evaporating instantly. James nodded silently. I retired at 29. Since then, I've been working whatever jobs I can find. Cleaning, maintenance, simple jobs, simple life. No spotlight, no cameras, no need to prove anything to anyone. The transformation in Derek was instantaneous and painful to watch. The arrogant man was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of his ignorance. I didn't know, Derek whispered. If I had known, if you had known, would you have treated me with respect? James interrupted gently. But would you still have humiliated some other janitor? Another worker who had no credentials to defend himself. The question cut deeper than any physical blow. Derek realized that James had put his finger on the root of his real problem. Not ignorance about his credentials, but the fundamental arrogance that made him believe he could humiliate people based on their professions. Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm. Sensei Derek, for 2 years, I have trained at this academy out of respect for your experience. But what I witnessed today was not teaching. It was bullying disguised as instruction. Other students began to murmur in agreement. The revelation about James had completely changed everyone's perspective on what they had witnessed. James, Derek said finally, his voice laden with a humility no one there had ever heard before. I sincerely apologize to you, to Sarah. To everyone here, I have no excuse for my behavior. James nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace with which he had mastered the physical confrontation. Appreciated, Derek, but apologies are only the first step. The question is, what are you going to do differently from now on? Derek looked around the room, seeing his students with new eyes. Some seemed disappointed in his behavior, others clearly re-evaluating everything they thought they knew about respect and hierarchy. I'll change, Derek promised. It'll take time, but I'll change. That's when Sarah asked a question that surprised everyone. Mr. Washington, would you consider teaching again? Because I think we could all learn a lot more from someone who understands that true strength comes with responsibility. James smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that night. Maybe, but not to teach fighting techniques. To teach something much more important, that respect isn't earned with belts or titles, but with character. As Derek fully absorbed the most humiliating lesson of his life, one question hung in the air. Would one night of humility be enough to transform decades of arrogance? Or would an even deeper change be necessary for true justice to be served? 3 months later, the gym had been completely transformed. James Washington was no longer just the janitor. Sarah Chun had convinced the gym owner to hire him as an instructor specializing in advanced techniques and martial arts philosophy. Derek Mitchell lost half of his students in the first week after the incident. The video Sarah had discreetly recorded spread across social media, showing a black belt being humiliated by a mere janitor. His reputation in the martial arts community was ruined. "Sensei James," Sarah said after a class on respect and humility, "thank you for teaching me that true strength doesn't need to be displayed to be recognized." James smiled, organizing the equipment. "The best lesson I can teach is simple. Never judge someone by their profession or appearance. Everyone carries stories that can surprise us." Derek continued teaching at a smaller gym, but now with a humility forced by public shame. He had learned the hard way that arrogance comes at a price. Sometimes justice comes quietly, like a storm that transforms everything without making a sound. James proved that true revenge is not destroying your opponent, but showing that greatness comes from character, not titles. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph. **